Good evening, welcome at the DMA, Design Media Arts Department. I'm Henry Lucas, the chair. We're starting our second lecture of the year, and I'm really happy to present Nicholas Felton, who since 2005 has been putting out annual reports based on personal information about his life. Music he listens to, booze he drinks, and it all ends up with annuals that explore the visual form of data visualization, but especially, I think, deals with storytelling. When I was in San Francisco a month ago, I bought the last issue of Good magazine, and there was an interview, I think, with you, but also with your mother and your girlfriend, and the question was, are these annual reports an actual representation of who he is? I think the answers are not so important, as well as the question that arises. We all think that working with numbers is factual, is a fact, and therefore the truth. And I think Nicholas has his own story about that. So, Nicholas Felton.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Casey, for inviting me here. I'm excited to show some of my work and my process to all of you. Unfortunately, I'm a little sick, so if my voice goes out, just give me a minute. So this is my presentation. I call it Numerical Narratives, which is just tied to this idea of finding stories out of numbers and out of data, which is what I've been doing for the last several years. This is some of the work that I was doing previously, doing information design and trying to extract these interesting stories or interesting compositions from the information that was provided to me by clients. Some of these examples include a visualization in the top left of Wikipedia's growth over the past 10 years, and it shows this amazing natural spiraling tendency based on the languages that Wikipedia existed in. I've been really interested in pushing this kind of work into places where it hasn't typically existed, like a wine label that you see on the right-hand side that talks about the sugar content and temperatures, the different grapes involved. There's also some work on typography and different typefaces, and then a look at CNN and the growth of its website over the past 10 years. So all of this work comes out of this drive that I've had as a graphic designer, as a creator, to have stories to tell. This was something that I felt the drive for in school and has never left me. So in school, one of the things I experimented with was taking artifacts from the novel Catch-22, turning them into real-life objects, but it was unsatisfying because I didn't have ownership over the source material, and I was always indebted to Joseph Heller for his story, and it didn't feel extendable. From that, I looked to invention, to writing fictional stories, which I'm not very good at, so I moved on to another approach, which is experience. And this is the source of stories and information that I have the most access to, and this is where the bulk of my work and my career has sort of blossomed, and I'd like to show you some of that process now. This is one of the first projects that I can tie this drive to. This is a project that I made with a girlfriend at the time in 2000. We called it Placation because it was the story of a fictional vacation that we took that summer. It was inspired by a bunch of past postcards that we found at a garage sale one summer. So this is the UN, this is a bus, and I think this was from South Dakota, and it was this really nice collection of imagery, and rather than put it in a drawer or send them out piecemeal, we decided to figure out if there was a way to link them together. And what we decided to do was tie them together into this fictional road trip. So here you can see this sketch that essentially plots out how this would lay out, how many days it would take. And we use this as a structure for connecting our daily experience in New York. And what happened was we kept loose notes of what happened to us. This is the type that was, the note that was written on a postcard. And the highlighted section refers to a time, I think it was July 5th, 2000, when I became horribly food poisoned from eating sushi in New York. So by this extrapolation, we would have been in South Dakota, where it made even more sense for me to get food poisoned. And this is how we presented it. We wrote out these postcards, we mailed them to our friends. There was a URL on the bottom where they could go and visit the entire story. And most of them understood that this was a fictionalization and we didn't actually take this road trip. But either way, I think it was a nice thing for them to receive and a way of adding a bit more adventure to our summer. In 2004, I made this little graphic for my website. And this is based on just a feeling that I think is common, where you want to encapsulate the previous year and move on to the next. So websites do this all the time. It's about every magazine does their end of the year issue. And what I found was that it was essentially qualitative statements about my favorite things, blogs and music and exhibits that I'd found. But I learned there was a little bit of quantitative information that I could extract from that year without digging too deep. I could look at my iTunes and I figured out what the song I listened to the most was. I could retroactively inspect my photos and find this ratio of film to digital and could tally up a couple of other things. And I enjoyed it, but I didn't really linger on it. The following year, I decided I wanted to repeat that gesture and make another encapsulation of the year. I thought it was going to be photo heavy. And the more I started looking at my history, the more I realized I had this archive of information that I could play with. These are some of the spreads from it, so I could dig into my photos historically and analyze them. I could look at my calendar, which looks like this. This is essentially just an abstraction of the ratio between work and play over the course of the year. So you can see a couple of week-long vacations in the spring, and then I took 4 or 5 weeks off to take a long trip in the summer, and then went back to my grind. This is an analysis of the photos, where I looked at the different countries that I went to on that trip and sort of got this interestingness matrix of the countries just based on how many photos I deemed worthy of taking there. And then by looking at my photos, I could break them down by subject and figure out that 1% of my photos were of my cat that year. Surprisingly, that document that I thought would only be interesting to people that knew me wound up getting traction. It started cycling around the internet. At least one stockbroker emailed me to tell me he thought it was fantastic. And the real culmination of my understanding that this was something worth pursuing was when a friend asked me if it was all right if she sent it to her brother. I'd never met her brother before and said, it's fine, but he won't care because he doesn't know me. And she wrote back and told me he really enjoyed it. So I decided to continue this. And in 2006, I actually set out to record information explicitly for the purposes of making a printed annual report. So this is the result. This is 06. These are some of the spreads where I dedicated a bit more time to it. I mailed these to anyone who sent me their address. I said, I'll just mail you a copy. So I sent out about 600 of these. And you can see I'm starting to play with mapping here and just curating this down to the things that I found the most interesting, like the worst mouthful in Williamsburg or best drink in a pool, which are just like ways of winnowing it down to the story that I want to tell. And I really like this stat because it encapsulates a lot of the qualities that I think are really inherent in this presentation of data, that it can be informative, it can solve curiosity, and it can be and it can be really memorable and even humorous. So this one's a lifelong favorite. In 2007, I pushed the envelope a little bit more and decided to figure out if I could actually sell these things, because then I could spend more time on them and get more elaborate with the printing. And I was able to sell however many copies I wanted to, 1,000 copies of the run of this one. And this is the only one I'll say this was the first time where I had like a couple explicit questions that I wanted to answer. I wanted to know how many cups of coffee I drank, which was one thing in the middle of 2006 I was really annoyed that I hadn't set out to track. But what streets I used was one that I thought would be really nice to know. So in New York, I tracked all the streets I used. And this is the first time I found a data stream that was just too annoying to keep tracking afterwards. Almost everything I've done, I've become sort of hooked on it, and I want to know how many miles I've traveled or how many cups of coffee I drink, but this one I abandoned after '07. So, in 2008, I set out to figure out how many miles I traveled over the course of the year. I wanted this one sort of talismanic number that would encapsulate all my actions. So whether I was sick and didn't move that far, or was in my daily routine, or if I was going on a vacation, I felt like all these would add up in different and unique ways to this one number. And it wound up being 38,524 miles. And I think that some of those are even imaginary miles, because Grand Theft Auto gave me really incredible stats about how far I traveled. So I was able to add those all in. And then I can humanize them down to a very relatable 4.39 average miles an hour for the entire year. Here you can see the cover, and we have that triangle at the top represents all miles, and the first bifurcation shows on the left the Grand Theft Auto miles, which are like helicopter and swimming and running and driving, and then the right is all the rest of my miles. So thankfully, the right-hand side is more interesting and complex than the left side. This is a little synopsis of my process. So, like I said before, I try to start with a question, something that I'm curious about, which is what drives me through the course of the year, to keep asking these questions, whether it's how far I travel or how many cups of coffee I drink. That's the push, and that's what leads to the methodology that allows me to research it. So I have to set up this formal structure at the beginning of the year and then just execute on that, follow the rules for the rest of the year. And then finally tackling the data and then the design. But I actually think the process is one of the most important pieces of this, and where a lot of the most interesting things happen that aren't visible in the finished product. These are some questionable slides. They're very debatable theories, but this is one of the things that drives my methodology creation. So I kind of feel like there's this sweet spot here that maximizes audience interest in exchange for creator pain. So me being the creator, I must find the most painful methodology I can tolerate to maximize my audience interest. So like for the past year, I've been tracking my life in 15-minute increments, and I think that's as far as I can go in order to maximize the audience interest. And then this is the landscape of sensors that I play in. I see these two axes, which are electronic and human, and active and passive, and I'll explain how I see that breaking down. Electronic and active are physical sensors. These are the ones we all have on us at the moment in the forms of our phones. Some of us may have pedometers like a Fitbit or the recent Jawbone Upband, and then GPS, whether it's in your phone or on a watch like this Nike one. So these are, they're electronic, but I consider them active because they require babying. They have to be plugged in, you have to make sure that they're connected and uploaded, and you have to make sure that you carry them when you want to record stuff. So there's still some friction there. The passive ones are the ones that I consider to be online. So this includes services that we use, like Last.fm, that just is like plug and forget. So you set that up, and then it'll just record your music from then on. Or with like the new streaming services, you can connect those and just have like an ongoing log of what you listen to. Mint.com, again, you plug it in, forget it. And Grand Theft Auto, you just start playing it, and it records what you do. This self-tracking is where I spend most of my energy. So this is human and active, requires a lot of effort, and this is training myself to be a sensor. So recording how many cups of coffee I have, or how many Michael J. Fox sightings I have. All these things have to trigger a reaction and inform me to write them down and to memorialize them so I can access it later. But where I've really found a lot of interest is in this last section, which is what are the things that are being tracked passively for us by other people? And maybe the name for this is shared tracking. I'm not sure, but I'll show some examples. These are taxi receipts from New York, which I discovered are an incredible source of data. These are things you can get for free. You do have to ask for them, but they'll tell you when you got in the taxi, when you ended your ride, how far you went, and how much it cost. And it would be amazing if this was online and available to us, but it is something that you can get very easily, and it is a really rich source of data. Passports. Again, these are things that have inherent record-keeping abilities just through the course of using them. So you get a time and location stamp just by the fact of entering a country and showing it. This is a look at some analysis that was done for a project a couple summers ago, but it was about the rise and fall of Bauhaus, and to come up with this idea of what the social capital of the artists involved with the Bauhaus and the Bauhaus itself, we decided to send a researcher to Berlin and just have them count every mention of the artist in this newspaper, Das Kunstblatt. So it's one way of slicing that, and it was we felt it was the best way we had of trying to get at this hidden data. So the 2009 annual report had its foundation in this. I was curious about how other people saw me and remembered me, and so I decided to outsource the data by asking other people to report back to me on my behavior and activities. So if we had a meaningful encounter in 2009, you would get one of these cards from me. And this wasn't just the first time you saw me, this was every day. So my office mates got one of these every day. My girlfriend got one every time I saw her. My dentist got one when I saw him because we talked too much. This is the back with the URL and an individual number. And I would track the location and date and who I gave this card to. And this is the stats on that. So over 200 individual participants with about a third completion and 1,700 encounters. And this is what I asked of them. So I wanted their name, what the number of their card was, our relationship, how long we'd known each other, the encounter duration, what we did, what my mood was, where we went, if we went anywhere else, if we ate something or drank something, any transportation that was used, and topics discussed. They could also provide a favorite moment and then just a free field. So this is all free text, loosely structured just by the forms that I provided. And I got about a novel's worth of words back. And one of the rules of this report was that I would take at face value anything that they reported. So there's been, this has led to some confusion. These reports were in the MoMA this summer, and they saw in here that someone had reported that they were my ex-wife, and this is untrue. And he's a tech writer for the New York Times, and he was just gaming the system, but it was one of the things that, if you're going to look at this set of data and you treat it at face value, and I didn't want to involve myself at all, then this has to be communicated. So it went through there. this is a sample report from a 5-year-old. I spent Easter with him, so this is one of the simpler examples, and you can see some of the highlights for him. Rather than complex eating and drinking, we just ate and drank. But it's one of my favorites. This is a sample of a portion of a report, and it shows some of the real complexity that I had to deal with in parsing all this information. So Sarah and I think Sarah cooked this meal for me, and it was great, but the reality is that it all has to go into a spreadsheet and be tagged so that I can make associations and I can figure out what's at the core of all these reports. So this is just the food page from, or the food spreadsheet. So it gets tagged like this. All the vegetables get singled out, the baked goods, the flavors involved, and the fruit. And then we get this. So this is the master list for all the vegetables consumed in 2009, just so that I can say I had 65 different types of vegetables. But this is the question that was almost at the heart of the project. I was really curious about what my mood was and did not want to self-report it because I don't feel it's accurate, and I don't know, people have an array of descriptive terms for it, and I didn't want to be involved. So I received hundreds of mood descriptions, and they were not helpful at all. And I started parsing the list and trying to give them values of whether they were happy or sad, and I was involving myself too much in this process. So I sent it to Amazon, to their mechanical Turks, to make sense of it. And these are essentially probably college students who are sitting around trying to get a penny or two a task. And I just asked them to rate these as happy or sad, or introverted or extroverted. They could also say they were neither or both. And so this is the spectrum of possibilities for any word. And it was great because I was not involved, and I got this index of all the terms. So I think I was saying earlier, Californian is slightly positive, but mostly neutral. And chopsticks. Chopsticks is better than Californian. It's happier than Californian. So the whole point of all that was so that I could tell you what my average mood was swell, which equates to 73.9% happy. And here you can see how that mood changed, the happiness and the sadness level altered over the year. So I have this idea I'm developing of sort of tip to tail, to borrow the term, approach to data, which is kind of inherent in the way that I work with it, where it's really hands-on. So by doing a lot of hand analysis of all these terms and all the data, you get this really involved sense, and that's where a lot of the best stories come from. So rather than doing a mechanical processing of it, I'm in there, I'm reading these reports that are being given to me, and you can find value in all these different facets of the data. So if you consider the exterior shape of the data, which would be anything, right? It could be the outline of the United States, it could be the shape of a pig, it could be this amoeba shape. It's what's the God's eye view of this data? So that's one thing, which in the case of the mood looks sort of like this. And then we have the dimensions of the data. So this is what's the breadth and the depth of this. So what are the categories involved? If we're thinking of the food that I ate in 2009, it would be what are the different types? And then within that, what are all the vegetables? So conveying that gives a sense of the fidelity of the data set and the detail within it. So this is where these types of displays come from. So telling you there were 300 different types of moods, or reports of being upset. And then there are the point pieces of data. So these are these examples, which are the individual reports that people gave me. And it could be in a data set like the temperature on a single day in a single place. But these can represent the outliers, the most interesting aspects of the set. And because this was in natural language, I felt like all these reports were pretty compelling. Now, the data set was another place where people could have some fun if they wanted to. But I was trying to show on the cover how long I'd known a person and how many opportunities they had to report versus how many reports they gave me. So in the second column of data here, you can see in days how long I'd known the person versus how many reports they filled out, and finally how many opportunities they had. So in the first column, you can see Amador Pons had the opportunity to do 213 reports, but only gave me 2. He's an office mate of mine. And this is the first strike at the data. You can see the data set on the left and the first processing sketch that I made to try and make sense of it. And after a bit more work on that, to assign the area of those shapes to how many reports they received, I got this sketch. And it's very accurate, but the problem is it's super dense on the right-hand side, which are people I'd met for the first time, versus on the left side, which are people who've known me all my life, like my dad and my sister and my mom. And fortunately, I was able to polarize the whole thing and then get a better distribution here. So by turning it into a circle with all the people who'd known me the least amount of time on the outside and the people who'd known me the longest on the center, I was able to maximize the circumference there and get a bit better distribution of all that data so that you could read it. And then that was the final result after a bit of noodling in Illustrator. This is playing with mapping and processing. So this is as far as I need to take it in processing. I'll export a PDF that looks like this and then overlay it on a map. And this is some of the printed output of the 2009 report. So extrapolating from this idea, it seemed to be a bit contagious. I would get these other annual reports being created by people at the end of each year. So this is Jarrett Fuller's 2009 report, another person who's taken this idea, recording transit expenditures and the coffee they drink. And I've even seen it show up in classrooms. So this was a high school project of trying to teach kids how to use statistics and how to do charting. So they kept their own Feltron notebooks. And this is the outcome. So tracking text messages over the course of the month. All this led to this idea for a company that I started with a friend called Datum. And the idea here was that based on the interest we'd seen in my annual reports, we felt that a lot of this was just based on a self-reflective reaction with them. So people were curious about how many cups of coffee they drank or how far they walked. And we wanted to give them a tool that would maximize ease of collecting and then just remove the display challenge from the process, so that people could get down to actually recording stories in this really granular way and communicate what they felt was interesting on a page. So this is a look at the website, and this is one of my pages from 2009 maybe. I've been tracking miles I walked, the days that I traveled, and we made an iPhone app for it. So this was essentially the end goal, was to have it be in your pocket, available at any time, so you could record things as they happen, and then have this data blog of the results of your tracking. You Here we see a person who is trying to drink 100 ounces of water every day and set this goal and could see the averages. This was one of our other favorites. This was a dog who had its own datum page, tracked like hot dogs that it ate in Central Park, other breeds that it met, and people started to get really creative with it. Like one person had a datum page for their couch in Brooklyn where they tracked who slept on it and things that were spilled on it. And they were able to imbue inanimate objects or non-people with real data stories that were compelling. So now I'd like to share with you the process of the last annual report that I created. And this one takes a bit of a different turn as well. My father passed away last September, and in the course of going through the materials he left behind, it became obvious that I needed to memorialize his life in the form of one of my annual reports. This is my dad in the 60s. Some of the artifacts that I knew he kept were his passports, which were incredible. So you can see there were 55 years of passports. There were English ones and American ones, and he traveled the world, so there were stamps throughout them. And even before he passed away, I'd thought about visualizing them because I really wanted to know him better and to see where he'd been to. This is another nice page. I had this mental idea that I could create this sort of pushpin map of all the places he'd traveled to and get to know him better. I also discovered insane bits of paperwork. This includes his grades from when he was a teenager in England. That's his first, this agreement of service for trade apprentice was his first job contract. We have his marriage licenses and original birth certificate. So some stuff going back to 29, some stuff going back even earlier. These are some of the things that I know about him, that he grew up in Nazi Berlin. He was part of the Kindertransport, which was children who were taken out of Germany in the late 30s, before World War II broke out, and sent to live with foster parents in England. His father was killed in concentration camps. Later in life, he was an elevator mechanic, and he traveled extensively. But lots of questions arose as I started going through his materials. There's a family lore that he might have been an agent of some sort, and all these things just stack up, like why was he in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and why did he spend so much time in the USSR, and stray coups that would happen and explosions that would go off. So a lot of these things just compelled me to want to know more about him and try and get to the heart of some of these questions. So as a part of the data set, we have these family photos that everybody has and some odd photos that not everybody has. And then real world artifacts or things he collected through his travels. And then he was really helpful, so he kept lots of great lists along the way. So the more we looked through his artifacts, the more we found these nice histories. So these are all his employers from about the 50s through the 80s. This is a list of everywhere he lived from 1953 onwards. Letters are the typical things that you find, but there are little nuggets in there that could be pulled out that helped solidify his history. And this is a good one. This is a list of the movies of 2003 where he's kindly gone through and marked off the movies that he saw that year. But I think this was the clinching piece of artifact or thing that he left behind. So this was a little scroll that I found in one of his drawers, and it had his name on it. It had the date, and I unraveled it, and I found it was an EKG. So as someone who trades in graphs, this was, the most sentimental graph I could imagine. This was his heartbeat. from before I was born on a piece of paper. So I think that was the real culmination of understanding that I wanted to make this project about my father. This is just a piece of the data set that I started with, stacks of planners and calendars, family trees, lots of slides and postcards. And all this is the stuff that gets processed and expunged in the course of making the annual report. But there are a lot of straight turns and interesting aspects to the processing that came up. So I'll show a little bit of that. There were family trees that were super helpful, but also out of date that needed updating so that I could make an accurate family tree. He had all these receipts and calendars. So these, again, had nice lists in the back of them of where he traveled. Sometimes he had really detailed calendars. So I input all this and tagged them and figured out which were trips, which were mentions of his children that would get processed. This one even has weather information. So this is when he was a trip that he took to Europe, where the very first thing he mentions is weather very good, weather good, weather cold and wet. And then sparser, more day-to-day calendars that I looked at. Typically, these are the sort of things that you would throw away immediately when going through someone's stuff, but I saw them through a different lens. These are just receipts from trips that he took, but again, these are date and location stamped. So if I'm thinking about the pins that I could put on a map to trace his course, now I know that in 2002 he was in Reims as a result of this receipt. So it's just an extra data point that I was thrilled he'd kept. This is a look at the desk calendars and how that all gets sorted out and filtered, so that I can make something like this. So this is an abstraction of his calendars that show how in the 80s his work recordings in his ledger went down as time with his children and time traveling increased. In terms of his papers, we have letters from his mom that were in German and needed to be translated, wedding or marriage licenses, and this is perhaps too nerdy, but this is evidence of the summer trip that I skipped so that I could save money to get my first computer. So blank postcards were really interesting. I made the presumption that if he had a blank postcard, it represented some place that he'd been. So most of them on the back had the name of a city that he'd visited. Some of them were large, some of them were small. But the postcards he received were even more interesting because they represented where he lived. So I had about 50 years of these, and I could pinpoint how he'd moved from Canada to the Bay Area and all the different places he'd lived there, including when he was living with friends. This is my first attempt to plot out where he lived in the Bay Area over from, I think, about 1960 onwards. This was done with OpenStreetMap data, but ultimately I decided against including the map because it felt like something that was outside of the information that I was culling from his data. So I decided to go with this approach, which was a triangulation of all the locations I was able to extract. And this felt more in line with the memories that I was trying to rebuild. And so for time periods early in his life, I had very few locations. And so the triangulation was very sparse and not that representative. But as you move ahead in time, the granularity gets better. And if you know the Bay Area, you can kind of see the Bay Area here. But when you zoom out to the world level, you can start to see the continents and the shapes, and you can see how the density represents the places that he knew best. His passports helped add to this. They were It was like spending a day doing CAPTCHAs, though, because all of these things tended to be more complicated than they needed to be in terms of figuring out the date formats, translating stray languages like Greek, trying to see through different colors to find legibility in these date stamps. And then the slides. So there were about 3,000 slides. I don't think I'd ever seen a slideshow from him, so they were all new to me. There were plenty with personal content that were easy to identify, like where and who's in it. There were lots with this sort of global context. So these were easy to parse. This is Brasilia when it was being constructed. This one I just like, so I put in there. And then there are these ones with lost context. So these are photos that I essentially gave up hope of figuring out. It would be possible to generally determine where this is, but I didn't have a means of getting at real location. Thankfully, there's a middle ground, and this is where I spent a lot of time. So these are the ones where, by brute force or stubbornness, you can figure out where they are. And thanks to the fidelity of 35 millimeter film, I was able to do things like realize that there's a piece of type there, and zoom in and determine that this was the Salinas Rodeo. Another factor at play is that Google image search is incredible, and it allows us to just guess and check our answers. So this was another slide that had a little detail here that said Dijon. So when I searched for that, it was fifth result is an image of that square. So you can see how they match up, and that location is now knowable. In this case, somewhere in my art history brain, I remember that this was called a stupa, and I looked for it, and again, in the 5th position. So thank you, Google. This one was a lot more stubborn. The context was sort of Siberia, and I just looked for Siberia Dam until pages and pages later, I figured out where this was. Text is really easy to discover. So anytime he was standing in front of a sign or something like this, it was just like a simple click away to the Wikipedia page that tells you exactly where this was shot. Sometimes I had hunches that I would explore. This was in the context of a lot of photos of Iguazu, but I didn't really know what the hotel was called, and it didn't have signage, so I went to the satellite view and pinpointed this and got a little CIA on it and was able to figure out what hotel this was. Unfortunately, this one, maybe it doesn't exist anymore, or Google's too late to the party, but I could not figure out where that was. Finally, there were ones that just foiled me, and I couldn't figure out where they were, but I felt they had enough of this idea of discoverable context in them that I put them online, I put them on Flickr, and I asked people to help out. So this one wound up having numerous clues that people were able to put together and figure out where it was. So we have like a Taiwanese flag, we have that mountain, and we have the unique architecture of this place. And so there's a whole thread here where people weigh in on this being, I think, like the Alishan guest house in Taiwan. Again, this one has a really long story, but essentially someone figured out these were French license plates and then did some Googling and wound up figuring out where this whole, that this is a church and where it is. These are some of the photos. These are some of the only artifacts that I included ultimately in the report. And then this is a look at the data set that went into it. So this is every year of his life and how much information was included in the report, starting in 1929 and going to his death. So you can see these patterns of ebb and flow. The one that I think I can explain is that in 1970, he married my mother, and she clearly took over record keeping from that point on. And then in 1985, they were divorced, and he was forced to maintain a calendar again. These are the sources. There are 25 sources involved. You can see the distribution by year. And this is this is like a finished page. So this has a bit of everything in it. It has that idea of data tip to tail, where there are certain snippets in it that represent a single moment in time. There's the overview, and there are categories. There are broad categories that are investigated, and these are his grades as visualized over time. And then finally, this is the map that I wanted to make. These are all the pins, essentially, spread over the globe. And you can see that the outlines of parts of the continents are visible. The United States, you can see the east and west coast. You can see a bit of the bulk of South America and Europe appearing. And then some other just little snippets that I could extract, like how did the northern and southern hemispheres compare to each other, and even figuring out where his average location was, which was, I think, somewhere near the Canary Islands. And finally, to wrap it up, I made this index. So we start with the table of contents, and essentially at the end, we end with a list of sort of life's achievements of all the museums that I could figure out he'd gone to, and all the movies he'd seen or restaurants. And ultimately, we had a memorial service for him in April of this year, and so it was a lot of 70 and 80-year-olds who came. And this is a strange document in very small type size, and I was pretty nervous that they would just not know what to do with it or what it was. And this idea of like seeing yourself in the data really came through, and they all understood it and immediately started pouring through it and finding like that was our wedding that he attended, or that was the restaurant that we used to go to, or we saw that movie together. And I was amazed. I really think it was a testament to the power of this medium, that people who are not online, have bad eyesight, and are not aware of their own data streams can really like find an affinity to this kind of document. So that's it. Thank you. Thanks so much.
There's a microphone going around for questions. So we're going to do a Q&A. Anyone who has a question?
Hey, thank you so much for giving the presentation. I was just wondering, after doing this project on your father, with such a connection to all of these dates and family and everything, are you kind of unsatisfied with like coffee data or going back to like charts of what you used to do now? Because it just seems like this project meant so much more to you and your family. Like, what kind of things are you interested in doing next after this?
Yeah, it's going to be really tough. And this was, an exceptional data set. It meant so much. It was such a more, important narrative than what bars I like to go to. But I don't think there's anything wrong with setting the bar really high and trying to exceed it, or at least match it this year. So I'll do my best, and if I think it's not good enough, then you won't see it.
This is another follow-up question to the project you did about your father. It's a really deep dive into a very voluminous data set, and I'm wondering how you would compare that to the sort of facile and surface level data that we interact with every day in social networking sites. And if you feel there's a way to bring more of the depth that you found in your annual report to the things we use every day, and relate that to your experience at Facebook now, if possible.
Sure. Yeah, for those of you that don't know, I now work at Facebook, and this project was actually given out. We reprinted it and handed it out to developers at the developers conference we had in September, which I think was a testament to how interested Facebook is in actually like telling meaningful stories with data and providing tools and showing developers like a road to doing interesting things with it, not just counting, but actually presenting useful stories. And one of the frustrations of doing this project is that in a world where photos are geotagged and the people in them are tagged, it's a lot easier to do. You don't have to spend a week of Christmas vacation sitting down with your mother and asking her, who is this, who is this, who is this? So, yeah, I mean, if this is the sort of document that people are interested in having about themselves, then it's where my interest lies as well. And I think that intersection with Facebook, with a tool that everyone uses, is really fertile, and that's why I'm excited to be there.
Hey, how's it going? I'm curious what the end result is. So, obviously beautiful. What does it do to you? What in the end do you gain from meticulously doing all this stuff?
Well, I very much see the work as, a forerunner to a lot of things that will just be possible in the future. And so if I can give some sort of guidance of what's interesting about this data exhaust that we generate, then I think that's very useful. And I very much enjoy the process of it. It's great research and development for my own design work. And as long as people are interested in reading them themselves, because surprisingly, people do read them cover to cover, then I think that's a great reason to keep producing them as well.
Hi. I'm wondering what your workspace is like, because it seems like this would be something that you do many hours a day and be really tedious. So I'm wondering, like, what environment you're in when you're doing all this.
Well, all the last annual reports were made in a studio that I shared with some architects in New York. It's not very big. It's got a big monitor and enough surface space to spread out a lot of receipts and a lot of ephemera that I collect over the course of the year, but it's nothing special.
Hi. The act of observing something changes it. So I'm curious, when you went from not collecting copious amounts of data about yourself to doing it every 15 minutes, how you think that changed your behavior in different aspects?
Well, one of the things I noticed about the report process as a whole is that it does make all your actions much more purposeful. And one of the things, the initial changes that I noticed was that there's this background voice of, what will this mean for the annual report, that would encourage me to venture out a little bit further or do something more interesting that I wouldn't normally do, or even to spin an experience in light of the annual report. Like, 2008 was an interesting year because it was not very exciting, and at one point in the year, the Secret Service knocked on my office door. And so the first reaction was, crap, it's the Secret Service. The second reaction was, this is great. This is going in the annual report. And it was just one of the things that livened up the year and was front and center in the annual report as well. I definitely try in terms of my methodology to not create one that's that interferes enough to change my behavior in noticeable ways, and it's a big part of the design of the systems that I execute in the following year. That I tend to test them out in the last month of the year just to make sure that they're not getting in the way. And that's why that example of the 2007 report where I tracked my walking, it was too tedious, and it meant that I was walking around constantly typing in my phone, like, turn left on Broadway, turn right on Crosby. So I hope that answers your question.
I'm curious what you think, now that you work at Facebook and have access to a lot of different data streams, if you took people who knew that their data was going to be published in some sort of annual report and they wanted it to be done, and compared their actions and the way they do things to people who maybe were unaware that it were to be published, just like you said, there's an inner dialogue in your head of, this is going in the annual report. Should I be doing something more interesting or this or that? Do you think that you would see a big difference, like people who are unaware versus someone who knew that people were going to see what they were doing and it was going to be published?
I'm sure it's different for everyone. So, Facebook they provide privacy controls, so you can manage any little piece of data now and make sure, like, if you don't want it to show up, then it won't show up. But I'm sure that balance is different for everyone.
I want to go back to the 2009 report when you had your friends help you out.
Mm-hmm.
I think you said you had like a 32% completion rate of
Yeah.
them helping you. Is there anything that you learned from that to maybe get that completion rate higher, to have your friends really help you out?
Well, I could get rid of my office mates because they were not good at it. But another person I know tried copying the methodology recently, and I think his completion rate was really similar. And he didn't repeat it among his friends. So I think he had the same threshold for whether he gave you a card or not. Maybe that would need to be higher, but I think he had about 200 participants, and it was around a third, and he was expecting it to be around 20%. I don't know. Probably also including fewer questions.
Hi. So this is a very, very obvious question. So in recent years, we have seen how the sort of like the traditional borderlines between design practices and art practices have become kind of fluid and sort of like difficult to separate from each other. Now, I think that this is also sort of like something that maybe concern what you're doing. So I'm just wondering how you feel about your work in terms of this sort of like art, design, scale, so to say. Where does it fit in on that scale? I mean, let me just mention that, I mean, that there's a tradition of artwork that is based on sort of like this kind of a, shall we say, slightly obsessive tracking of one's data body and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I love that art as well. I don't consider myself to be an artist exclusively, but the recent MoMA exhibit that featured the annual reports was a lot about that, and I think there was the recent show at the Walker Art Center is tackling the same thing, that designers are like, they're having to find a voice, they're having to make more content, whether that is art through an art practice, or whether it's through research, or whether it's through, fictional works, or what have you. I think that's an increasing role of a designer, is as an author. And so I'm inspired by artists like Candy Jernigan, who've done these sort of tracking projects, and I'm happy to be influenced and inspired by them.
My first question is, what did the Secret Service want? And my second question is, I come from the sciences, and I deal with extremely data-rich data sets all the time, and I'm totally intrigued by your work, and I wonder if you see, or what you see, this kind of visual communication of numbers, how it can impact different fields outside of art and design.
Sure. Well, the Secret Service, they were looking for a check forger, I think, who was not one of us, but had been using our address. And as far as science go, I guess I'm a failed scientist. I thought I was going to be a scientist in high school, so I think a lot of the affinity for numbers and visualization that you see, or maybe even like the inherent curiosity, is coming from that desire to know things about my behavior or my experience. And data visualization is a huge part of the sciences, but I think it's getting an even bigger kick in the butt, because there is just so much data that individuals are coming into contact with now, and people need tools for making sense of it, for making decisions, to the end that I'm interested in, telling stories, telling funny stories sometimes, trying to tell tragic stories. I think just like there's the full range of narratives that we can hopefully do all these interesting things with data visualization.
All right, Mr. Felton has time for one more question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask you if obsessive compulsion is perhaps helping you in the design process, because all of the data seems incredibly tedious and just so detailed. So if there is, and your father, with collecting all those, receipts and everything, it kind of seems like it might be running in the family.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll give you the genetic overview of my family. So you've seen my father's compulsions. My mother also has about 50 years of diaries, and my sister is an accountant. So, my girlfriend and I joke that as long as it's just OC and little d, it's okay. And so when it becomes a big D, that we've got a problem. So, all right. Thank you so much.